Hi, welcome back. So this lesson is completely optional. It's a little bit of a bonus. It's really something that is somewhat interesting, that's why I'm showing it to you, but it's not essential to the course. And we're going to talk about how ForEach works, and we're going to build our own version of ForEach. So we're going to talk about how you write a function that takes a function as an argument and then executes that function inside of it. So again, completely optional. The other reason I'm making it optional is that it's a little bit more advanced, and I don't want to intimidate everyone. I don't want you to feel bad if it's confusing to you, because it is confusing, and often it takes multiple repetitions of this for my students to get it. So it's totally optional. And this is important, but it's not essential to making applications. It's not essential to moving forward in the course. It is something, though, that if you try watching it once now and it doesn't make a ton of sense to you, you could revisit it towards the end of the class once you get some more experience with JavaScript. And that's something I have to do with my students in person all the time as well. As I mentioned, we do revisit this topic. So let's start. We're going to build our own ForEach. And we're going to start by defining a function just called ForEach. And it's going to work a little differently than the way that the real ForEach works. Because right now, the way that ForEach works is I define an array, let's just call it nums, and we'll have some numbers in there, like that. And I call ForEach on nums, so nums.forEach, and then I give it a function, and we just saw this, so I won't bore you too much, hopefully, but we'll just call this num, and then let's just do a simple console.log num. There we go. It takes a function, and it calls that function on every element in the array, nums. But notice that we didn't have to pass nums into ForEach. It just knew about the numbers. It knew about the array because we did nums.forEach. So we're not going to start by defining a function that works that way. We're going to start with one that looks like this. We'll call it my ForEach. And rather than taking just one argument, it will take two. And the first one is the array, and the second one is the function. So array will be like nums, and this will be the function. So if we wanted to run the same code with nums, it would look like this. My ForEach, nums, comma, and then our whole function here, which will look the same as the one up top. So we're starting out with this version because it's simpler. It's a little more syntax, but it's simpler for us to write. So again, we're passing in nums rather than just grabbing it. Using special JavaScript magic, there's a way to grab it if you're defining a method on something like we have here. But we'll get to that. Okay, so let's define a function, my ForEach, and it takes in an array and a function. And we can't call that function because that's a special word in JavaScript, so we'll call it func, or f, whatever you want to call it. And then we'll open up our function. And let's start by talking about what ForEach actually does. So remember, it takes that function and it calls it for every item in the array. So in order to do that, we need to use a loop. To do anything for every item in an array, we have to have a loop. So we'll just use a for loop. We'll loop through array. And then in that loop, we're just going to call function. And all we need to do to call function is add parentheses at the end. So it's a little bit confusing. This is something my students always struggle with, and anyone who's learning JavaScript gets hung up here. But remember the distinction between the name of a function without parentheses. That's just referring to the function itself, but it's not executing it. As soon as I add the parentheses, it takes that code inside of func and it executes it. So I can give you an example here. If we just do, let me cut this out. If we just do alert doesn't actually run, but as soon as I add those parentheses, we get an alert. And I didn't pass anything in, but it still executed the code. So let's go back to our code, and rather than just calling func straight away like this, we'll loop through the array. So I'll add a comment, loop through array, and then inside the loop, call func for each item in array. So to loop through the array, we'll just use a for loop. You could also use a while loop, but we'll use a for loop. So for var I equals 0, I is less than arr.length, which is the name of the argument, arr, and then I++. Just like that. And then I'll move this line into our loop, because what we want to do is inside this loop, we want to call func. So we can start by just calling func, just like that. So whatever function is passed in as the second argument is going to be called once for every item in the array. We're still missing an important piece, which is to actually pass the data from each item in the array in, but this will call it for every item. So let's hit enter. And now let's try running this. So I'm going to define an array called colors, our favorite, my favorite at least, orange, and we'll just stop at yellow. So 3 items. And then I'm just going to call my ForEach and pass in colors as the array. And then I'll just do alert. And we don't add parentheses, remember, because that will immediately execute alert. That's not what we want. We want the function my ForEach to be the one to execute alert. So remember that func is actually alert in this case, but it could also be console.log, or most often it would be an anonymous function we define that would be called inside of func. So let's change it back to alert, and as I hit enter, I get 1 alert, I hit OK, I get another alert, I hit OK, and I get 1 more alert. So what's happening is that this for loop is looping over array, which in our case is an array of colors with 3 items. So 3 times it loops, and each time it calls func. And all that func is alert. That's all that it is. So it alerts an empty alert 3 times because we're not passing anything into func. So to make it work with data being passed into alert or whatever func is, all we do is pass a little bit of data here. And that little bit of data is supposed to be each item in the array. So the way that we access each item is by using I. So if I recall the code, in here I just add array bracket I. So the first time through the loop, this will call func, which is alert in this case, with the first item in the array, which is red. So we'll get alert red. And then I becomes 1. So then we call func, which is still alert, with array of 1, which is orange. So we get alert orange. And then one more time, alert yellow. So you'll see that right now if I recall my execution here, my ForEach colors alert. Now it gives me red, orange, and yellow. And that's actually all there is to defining ForEach. However, as I said, most of the time you won't see it like this, where we pass a named function in. Usually we'll have an anonymous function. So let's now give it a shot, but using an anonymous function. So my ForEach, and then we'll pass in colors again, and then an anonymous function. And remember that even though there's parentheses here, these are very different parentheses than the ones that invoke a function. So let me actually show you what I mean. If I delete this first part, and I just have an anonymous function right here, and all we do inside is console.log I'm a function. And I hit enter right now, and I can space this out a bit for you so it's a little easier to see what's happening. What do you think is going to happen? Well, of course that happened. Let me go back and add in the closing parenthesis for my console.log. Now what do you think is going to happen? I guess that kind of ruins the moment here. But as I hit enter, you'll see that nothing really happens. I get a value that's returned to me, a value that's sent back, but the code isn't run. I don't see console.log. And that's because this anonymous function was never invoked. Basically, it existed for a moment and now it's gone. I didn't give it a name. I didn't save it to a variable. I can never call it again unless I rewrite it. So to execute this function, I still need those parentheses afterwards. So this is a lot of syntax. It's kind of ugly in my opinion. But now if I add those parentheses, I get I'm a function. So it's the same thing when we do this. My ForEach colors, and then we pass in an anonymous function here, and let's say that this function does anything at all. Let's just say alerts hi. This function isn't being invoked right here. This is the function right here. We still need those parentheses afterwards like we have here. And that's coming from inside my ForEach, where we're adding those parentheses onto func. And func, in our case here, is the entire second argument. So if you're a little bit lost on this, don't worry. Again, this isn't crucial to the rest of the course, but try this again later at the end. So I can do something like this, where I just alert high, where I'm not actually using the data, like red, orange, and yellow. It's not that common to want to do that, but if I hit enter, you'll see I get 1 high, 2, and 3 highs. So for each item in that colors array, there are 3 items. It calls this entire function. But more often than not, what we want to do is actually make use of that color, like we're doing here, where we console.log each color. So all we have to do is accept an argument in our function. So my ForEach, and let's space this out a bit. So function, and this will be called color, but that can be anything, of course, just like any other function that we define. It can be almost anything. It does have to be a valid JavaScript name. It can't be something like function or var that are reserved or they're keywords, but anything else will work. So that's what we have here, an anonymous function that now is expecting an argument, and then we can use it inside of here. So console.log color to start. So to walk through this one more time, we loop through colors in this case. That's what array is, ARR. We loop through that. Each time through, we're calling func, which is this entire thing right here. And we're calling that and passing in the current item in that array. So we're calling this code right here, and then we're passing in red, and then orange, and then yellow. So color is equal to red or orange or yellow every time through this loop. As you can see, we get red, orange, and yellow. So that's the basic way of writing ForEach. But as I promised, I would also show you how we could add it on to an array. So we could write it like this, colors.ForEach or .myForEach, since there's already a ForEach there. We'll leave it alone, but colors.myForEach, and then we can pass in a function here. To do that, I'm going to jump a little bit ahead of myself. We haven't talked about objects yet. We haven't talked about prototypes, but I'm just going to show it to you here, and then you'll learn more about it as the course goes on. In fact, the next unit is all about objects. So what we do is we actually add a method to array.prototype. Prototype. You can never spell it. And we'll call it myForEach. And before I do that, notice the autocomplete. These are all methods that exist on the array prototype. So that's where we get all of those methods like push and pop and shift and unshift and ForEach that exist on every single array. They're defined on what's called the array prototype. And anything defined on that prototype is available, it's usable in every single array. So let's try this now. Array.prototype.myForEach is a function. And the function only takes one argument now, like we have here. It just takes func. And then inside, we need to do our same logic where we loop through the array and then call function for each item in the array. The only thing that changes is we're not accepting an argument, ARR. We don't have the array anymore. But we do have it here. It's a little bit different. We have to use the keyword this. So the keyword this is going to refer to the particular array that we're calling this on. So in the case of colors.ForEach, if we wrote the keyword this inside the ForEach definition, it would refer to colors. But if we did numbers.ForEach or dogs.ForEach, this refers to the specific array that we're calling it on. So we're going to do a for var I equals 0 while I is less than this dot length I++. So that's the first change. We use this dot length, which is referring to the specific array. So we're not passing it in anymore. The next thing that we do is we call func, just like we did in the original version, except instead of array bracket I, all we do is this bracket I, just like that. And that's actually all there is to it. So we just adapted it a little bit by replacing ARR, which was the name of our argument. That could have been anything, of course, by replacing it with the keyword this. So let's try it out. To use it, we need to make a new array. So I'll make one called friends, and we'll have it have a few friends: Charlie, Dave, Maddie, and Caitlin, just like that. Hit enter. Now we can do friends.myForEach, and that takes a single function as an argument. So we could just give it alert if we wanted to. And we get Charlie, Dave, Maddie, and Caitlin. But typically we would see it with an anonymous function like this, myForEach, and then a function in here. And let's say each one of these is a name. And then what we would do, it's up to us, but let's do something like console.log I love plus name. There we go. And we get I love Charlie, I love Dave, I love Maddie, I love Caitlin. Okay, so that's all there is to it. And I don't mean that in a flippant way. There is a lot to it. But as far as the code, it's actually pretty short. Just some new concepts. This prototype thing, which I really didn't go over, and I did that on purpose. It's not that important right now to focus on that. But what I do want you to focus on is this idea of passing a function around. So we can pass a function to an argument, or as an argument, and it won't be executed until inside the code we actually refer to it and add those parentheses at the end. So without those parentheses, the function doesn't do anything. It exists, it's a value that we can reference, but we add the parentheses and it's actually executed. All right, great. I'll see you in the next unit where we start talking about objects.